Hey, we're going to conclude our series today, and it's on a letter from a pastor, and we've been studying from Hebrews for the last part of the summer and beginning fall to look at what we felt like would be some core principles that we needed to learn in a church who has been on fire for God. And Each Cross has been a church that has been making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world since its inception and since its beginning years ago, about 50 years ago. And so it's exciting to be a part with you in this. And I guess 70 years ago now. Wow, we're getting kind of old, aren't we, as a church? So we're kind of talking about reinventing things around here. All of our staff, we're kind of looking at what we need to do new and different that will lead us into the future. And part of the help is coming from the book of Hebrews and what we need to do to get back to the basics of the Christian faith. And so I like what we're going to do today. We're going to finish the series. So we're going to look at chapter 12. I didn't include chapter 13. I was going to, but just the sermon will be too long. So we're going to just do 12. And I want to look at that. And so as the writer starts to sum up this letter that he's writing to this church that has been an awesome church, but it kind of got sidelined and started looking at all the minors, started making majors out of the minor things in the world. And so when he's pulling them back, he tells them to run with endurance. He tells them to run the race that's laid before them. Then he talks about this cloud of witnesses that's going to be there and participating or watching or dealing with them, working with them, helping them through this process. And so as we think about that, think about this cloud of witnesses that's there. And can you see the cloud of witnesses? There's they put this tent, set this tent up over there so they can watch the race. And we're running this race that we called life. And we went through the list of some of those that were in this cloud of witnesses in chapter 11 when we covered that. There'd be Noah and his wife would be sitting over there, probably Abraham and Sarah. And then you have Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel, and of course you can see Moses, and then there's Miriam, and there's Joshua, and then there's Rahab, there's the prophets, there's the kings, there's the martyrs. All these people are with us, and the place that we pull all of this together, that God pulls all this together, is in a way that we'll be celebrating in just a few minutes called Holy Communion. It's in Holy Communion that we are joined with all the Christians of all the ages together into the body of Christ. And so as they're there, there's this great cloud of witnesses as we're running the race, because here's the thing, it's a race and it's a marathon that we're running in this thing we call life. So let's start with chapter 12, verse 1 as we begin. And here's the people to cheer us on as we run. There's some people here to cheer us on even when we fall. And are you ready to see what the pastor says here? Hebrews 12:1 says this, "So then with endurance, let's also run the race that is laid out in front of us, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us." And then he says, "Let's throw off any extra baggage, get rid of the sin that trips us up." Have you ever noticed that sometimes we fall in our Christian walk? Have you noticed that? Sometimes we fall. But when we fall, the important thing, of course, is to get up and finish the race. Sure, your knees and your elbows may be scratched, and your jersey may get have skid marks on it, and sure, somebody may claw over you trying to get ahead of you in the race. But it's important for us to get up and continue. And we can get mad even sometimes because this race we call life doesn't seem quite fair. We pick the size of spikes we want, and come to find out the track we had needed a different length of spikes. Or there's some gravel on that corner. That's always a killer for the motorcycle. If you got some gravel on the corner and you spin out, or maybe sometimes we eat the wrong pre-race meal, right? We have not enough carbs and too many proteins, and it just sets heavy on us. And there's always these things always these reasons that we can find to be a little upset in this race we call life. Because sometimes we fall, sometimes we fail. And I know that that's not that much fun to hear about. When we come together, we want to hear about winning, right? I'll tell you that sometimes we're going to lose, and when that happens, we're faced with a decision, and that is, are we going to lay there on the track, or are we going to get back up and finish the race? The pastor tells his church, with endurance, let's run the race that is laid out in front of us. And you know, sometimes there are different games. Have you noticed that? There are different games. Sometimes you win the game, and to win the game means the game's over. And sometimes, if you're winning at the game, you stay in the game and you're not kicked out, because life is that way. If you're winning the game, you get to stay in. So I think it's important for us to stay hooked up. And sometimes, and some days in life, winning is just not quitting. Some days we can feel the victory, and you can almost hear da 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 in the background as the wind sweeps through your hair, and at the majesty of the wonderful wind that you have. And some days it's just not that great. Some days, if you just don't quit, it's a real win. Let's continue on to verse 2, because it continues. I'm going to go back and read part of verse 1 as well, because it's part of the sentence. So let's throw off any excess baggage, get rid of the sin that trips us up, and fix our eyes on Jesus, faith's pioneer and perfecter. He endured the cross, ignoring the shame, for the sake of the joy that was laid out in front of him, and sat down at the right side of God's throne. So through the most difficult parts of this marathon that we call life, we look to Jesus, and we remember that He suffered and He died for us so that we might live for Him. And so to run this race means to give our all. So the pastor is telling us here we need to lay aside these weights, lay aside these sins, so that we can worship and serve Jesus, knowing that our endurance, our perseverance will be rewarded. And hopefully this is a long race, right? We want to have good long lives. It's a marathon. And so we pick up our cross and we follow Jesus where Jesus leads us. Remember, we're learning to follow Jesus. So think about Jesus' journey to the cross. Matter of fact, in chapter 12, we're in chapter 12, in verse 3, it says this: think about the one who endured such opposition from sinners so that you won't be discouraged and you won't give up. When we look at what we're going through, sometimes it really helps to see what was happened to Jesus, because sometimes our suffering is not as bad, right? Sometimes we can be reminded that we didn't die the death that's deemed the most cruel death in the history of the world, that Jesus suffered. But here's the thing about the reason we need to remember it. It's not just that. The reason we need to remember Jesus' suffering death is because it's in that God brings about the redemption of our suffering and our pain. God has this way of redeeming our suffering and our pain. You see, Jesus was willing to suffer and die on the cross so that He could offer grace and forgiveness and salvation. And He offers that to all who call on His name. And then on the third day, God redeemed the suffering and raised Jesus from the grave. And so this pastor talks about our journey, about this journey, this race, this marathon. And he starts using some different terms in chapter 4. He starts off talking about the race, and then he goes on and starts talking in different terminology. So let's continue to follow his process, his mind process, as he writes this letter, preaches this sermon. Verse 4, in your struggle against sin, you haven't resisted yet to the point of shedding blood. In other words, you haven't given your life yet, right? And you have forgotten the encouragement that addresses you as sons and daughters. My child, don't make light of the Lord's discipline or give up when you are corrected by Him, because the Lord disciplines whomever He loves. I'll just repeat that. I think it's important. The Lord disciplines whomever He loves, and He punishes every son and daughter whom He accepts. Sounds like a harsh word, But here's what their pastor of this congregation's talking to them about their current situation. He's saying that their current suffering is God's discipline because they have quit following the main thing, which is Jesus Christ. Now, I want to be clear that we believe that God doesn't harm, and that when something bad happens, we shouldn't say it must be God's will. I mean, when we suffer, it doesn't always mean that God is disciplining us, okay? It doesn't always mean that. But here's the thing. Maybe sometimes that is happening. Maybe sometimes God does allow us to go through a season of testing so that God can shape us and form us because there's something in our future, something coming up in which we need to be prepared, for which we need to be prepared. Sometimes God allows us to go through a season of testing so that God can shape us and form us for the future that He has laid out for us. And actually in this passage, what the pastor here is doing, he's quoting Proverbs 3, verses 11 and 12. And he does this to remind the congregation that God is their Father and that we are God's children. We're not just servants. Yes, we're to serve. Yes, we are to do the work of God. But we do that as God's children and not just as servants. We're reminded of that in this passage. Good parents discipline their children. That's the way it works because they love them. And they do it with the goal of teaching and forming them as they grow and they mature. And God's discipline is not meant to cause us to lose heart. And actually, it may even seem a little painful at the present time. Does anybody here love to be disciplined? Is that just something that you just thoroughly enjoy, getting in trouble? Now, I don't think there's any of us that do that, but God helps us grow through this difficult time in our lives. And as a result, produces a harvest of righteousness and peace. Let's go on with what the pastor is saying in verse 7. Pardon me. He says, bear hardship for the sake of discipline. God is treating you like sons and daughters. What child isn't disciplined by his or her father? But if you don't experience discipline, which happens to all children, then you are, catch this, what he's saying, you are illegitimate and not real sons and daughters. You catch that? If we're not disciplined, then we're not real sons and daughters. What's more, we had human parents who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? Our human parents, listen to what he talks about human parents. Our human parents disciplined us for a little while as it seemed best to them. Anybody here feel like their parents got it exactly right? Probably not. But we do our best, and there's this benefit, for that. But listen to what he says. He goes on. So it's what our parents discipline us is what seemed best to them, but God does it for our benefit so that we can share in His holiness. Sometimes our parents discipline us to get the results they want, right? Like, for instance, if you were one of the Burress boys growing up, it was very important to my dad that anytime you went any place and you were known as one of the Burress boys, that they would have this glowing picture of young men who were dressed properly, who had their hair cut nicely, and acted with great respect. That was important to my dad. And so we were disciplined if we didn't fall into that line. So we usually did. Now, so Dad disciplined, my dad disciplined, that probably all of ours did, some for our benefit, but some for what they wanted. But listen to what he says about the Father, but God does it totally for our benefit so that we can share in His holiness. It's not that God wants us to look just like Him. That's not the reason He does that. He does it so that we can share in His holiness. Now, the more we get closer to holiness, the more we will look like God. But that's not the benefit. The benefit is for us, and that's what God's whole concern is. But let's go on to verse 11. No discipline is fun while it lasts, but it seems painful at the time. Later, however, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness for those who have been trained by it. So here's the thing, as God disciplines us, we grow in discipline. Okay? Using the word differently, catch on. As we're disciplined, we learn to be better disciplined. Being disciplined by God, or even growing to have discipline ourselves, isn't always fun. Here's an example. It's not fun to turn down that awesome dessert when you're on a diet. Right? It's not fun to go work out in the gym. I don't care how cool the machinery looks. I don't care how pumping the music is. You just hurt when you get done, you know? It's not fun. It's not fun to run those extra laps after practice. I mean, what do we call our coaches when we're muttering under our breath, we're running those laps? Yeah, we won't repeat any of those things, right? Because it's like, I can't believe you're making me do this. I can't believe, I want to see you run these laps. I remember saying those things under my breath. But here's the thing. Everybody admires a person who has discipline. Right? Everyone's impressed when you've lost weight. Everyone is pressed just to see how long you can continue to run out on that soccer field or through that marathon. You know what impresses me when I drive down the road? Cars, I like vehicles and I like cars and motorcycles. Y'all know that. But what really impresses me is when I see on the back of those stickers on the back of a car, and it says 13.1 or 26.2. That's the miles that's in a half a marathon or a marathon, right? Is that correct? The miles, or is it miles, right? That's impressive. I don't think it would be fun to run one. I'm sure there's a lot of training. I've never run one. But I'm impressed by people who can do that. We don't enjoy being disciplined, but we love the results. And there is a fruitful harvest of being disciplined and when we live a disciplined life. So this marathon, this journey we're on, rewards those who are disciplined, who endure, and who finish. Have you ever considered the impact of a faithful, disciplined person? The impact that person can have on your life? I was asking Mr. Rick in the first service. He said he had taught the little kids, the 4-year-olds, for 26 years, 27 years, something like that. Can you imagine the years of those kids coming through 4 or 5 a year for that many years? Well over 100 kids come through, maybe 200 kids came through there. And when they came through there, he's helped change their lives. Some of you have been teaching Sunday school. Some of you have been very faithful and disciplined, and you've done your job, what you felt called to do in helping children. Some of you have taught school and helped influence lives. And some of you are in the process of doing it, and it's maybe a 30-year journey or a 35-year journey. Just think of all the kids that you can affect positively because you have a disciplined life. You're a disciplined person. When we endure, many people are blessed. So you know the story of the tortoise and the hare, right? I won't tell the whole story because you know it, but here's this rabbit. The rabbit can run fast and they're going to race, and the tortoise is so slow, and so the rabbit doesn't worry about it. He knows he can win, so he goes and he nibbles on this, nibbles on that, and then he's kind of full, and so he kind of leans back and he takes a nap on the side of the road, and then when he wakes up, he realizes it's time to jump up there and get to the end, and he gets there, the tortoise just crosses right in front of the rabbit. Sometimes our life is about perseverance. It's about endurance. And when we endure, many people are blessed. This pastor says, with endurance, let's run the race that is laid out in front of us. Let's continue with verse 12, starting at verse 12. So strengthen your drooping hands and your weak knees. Now, say in the first service, we also said get all those joints replaced that you need replaced, right? So strengthen your drooping hands and weak knees. Make straight paths for your feet so that if any part is lame, it will be healed rather than injured more seriously. Pursue the goal of peace along with everyone and holiness as well, because no one will see the Lord without it. Listen to this. Make sure that no one misses out on God's grace. Make sure that no root of bitterness grows up that might cause trouble and pollute many people. So here's the thing, we're in this together. We're running together. We're not running against each other. We're running with one another. And so when the people of this congregation lag behind or stop coming to church, it's our responsibility to encourage them so that they don't fall away from God's grace. We'll come back to that. But here's something else the pastor does. He also warns us about the damage that bitterness can cause. Have you ever gotten bitter over something and you've watched how that infects everything that you do? It infects every relationship you have. It infects every job that you do when you let this bitterness take root in your life. He warns against that. But he doesn't warn us to condemn us. He just warned us because he cares. But I want us to focus on the first part. And I want you to read this with me. I'm going to have her put it up on the screen, the first part of verse 15. And I want you to read this with me because I think this is, if we're going to put this into one sentence, it would be this. Would you read this with me? Make sure that no one misses out on God's grace. Is that your pastor's job? Yes, it is. Is it your associate pastor's job? Yes, it is. Is your children's minister's job? Yes, it is. Is it the secretary's job? Yes, it is. Is it the custodian's job? Yes, it is. Is it the member's job? Yes, it is. Is it the attender's job? Yes, it is. If you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, it's your job to make sure that no one misses out on God's grace. So I want you to read with me one more time. Let's read it. Here you go. Ready? Make sure that no one misses out on God's grace. It's our job to care about people. It's our job. You know, and sometimes people don't think we care, right? Have you been there yourself that you didn't think anybody cared? Have you been to that place and you know people who thought no one cared for them? I'll tell you a story. There's this large church, and this church was large enough that you could kind of get lost. You could be anonymous in the church, and people wouldn't know. And so there was a leader of the church, and he had a district meeting to go to right after church, and so he was trying to get out quickly after church was over, and so he said bye to his family. As he headed out the back door, to go out the back door of their church, he had to go through the choir room. And so as he was going through the choir room, the choir was putting up the robes, and so he passed this woman that he had known real well, that had been going to church forever, and she was putting up her robe. And so as he was walking by her, he said to her, hey, I really enjoyed the anthem, the special music this morning. And she said, well, I hope so, because that's it. Well, what do you mean that's it? I'm hanging it up. Well, she was hanging up her robe. He said, yeah, you're hanging it up, huh? And she said, I'm hanging it up. Well, what's the matter with you? This is my last Sunday, she said. Well, he thought she was retiring. I mean, after all, she'd been in the choir for 103 years, and her voice was starting to crack a little bit, and she probably sounded kind of like I did when I was on the mic earlier today, maybe, I don't know. And so he thought she was retiring. She said, no, I'm not retiring, I'm quitting. Why are you quitting? He said. And she responded with this. She said, I finally accepted the question this morning that's been haunting me for years. I sat up in the choir this morning and I looked at all the people here. I looked at the minister. I looked at the choir director. I looked at the ushers doing things. And finally, it just sunk in on me. Who cares? And he said, who cares? She said, who cares? Who cares whether I'm in the choir or not? Who cares if I'm even here or not? He said, oh, you're just kind of feeling bad. Go home, take an aspirin, have a nice lunch, and you'll be all better, right? Well, he left, but he couldn't get us off his mind. And after he attended the rally that he had to go to and the district meeting and everything was done, he started thinking what she had said indicted them all. Because it doesn't matter how beautiful the music or how big the budget, if they didn't care for her, they weren't really the church. You know, they could not assemble if they didn't care for her, they couldn't assemble in the name of the one who would not even break a bruised reed, according to what the Bible says about God, about Jesus. And so he was at this meeting. It kept worrying him. He kept thinking about it. And so on his way home, and he called her and he said, "Hey, do you mind if I come over and talk to you?" And she said, "Well, if you want to, you can." He says, "Well, I want to." And so he went over and they talked, and he said, "You know, you're wrong." She said, "I'm not wrong." He said, "Do you know what you did? You said to me this morning that we're not the church." And she said, "Well." And so he told her a little church history, and we talked a little bit about this in one of our sermons in this series. And he told her, he said, what you said about the church was called what it was called in one of the old days was one of the 7 deadly sins. It was akadeia. Now, akadeia was translated sloth in church history, and that's really not a good translation. The word akadeia in Greek really means I don't care. Think about it. It's possible for a person to walk by an older person sitting all alone and say, "Well, he's not my dad, she's not my mom, surely they have some kids somewhere that'll help them." It's possible to see a child that's cold and hungry and think, "Well, I'm sure their parents will come, grandparents, somebody will come and take care of them," and just go past them. It's even possible to see a person that's recently widowed staring out from dull, gray, saddened eyes and say, "You know, that's not my parent. I know their kids, I'm sure their kids will help them out." And it's possible to hurl one final insult at the world: I don't care. Let me get back to the story. So he said, "Lady, do you realize what you just did? You've charged me and you've charged your whole church with one of the 7 deadly sins." And she said, "So." But here's the thing about this church leader. This is not the first time that he had heard this criticism. It just not from her. He had heard it most forcefully actually from his father. His father didn't go to church, and his mother took him to church when he was young. And every once in a while, the pastor would come by the house, and he would try to talk to the father, and always made his mom nervous when the preacher would come by and talk to his dad, because if his dad got pressured, his dad knew words. You know? He could, what's that? Blue streak, that blue streak thing, he had that down. My dad used to say he could cuss like a Philistine. I don't know what that means. But I think it means that they use words that we don't normally accept in our society. And so he got under a little pressure, and she was always worried. And sometimes a pastor would bring a guest evangelist. It was almost like the pastor was saying, sick him, come on, get this guy. We need him in the church. We want him in church. And, and the pastor or this church leader's father's expressions were always the same. And this son, which was the man that was visiting with the lady, he had heard him 1,000 times, because he would say every time, "This church doesn't care anything about me." Another name, another pledge. What are you after? Another pledge? What's the matter? Is the budget a little low? Another name, another pledge. "You don't care about me. Thank you, Reverend." He had heard him say it 1,000 times. And he said often his mom would be in the kitchen crying while his dad was raking the pastor over the coals. But there was one time that he tells this story, there's one time that he didn't say that. He was in a hospital at Memphis, Veterans Hospital, and he had gotten down, this church leader's dad, he had gotten down to 71 pounds, he had cancer of the throat. By the time he got to the doctor said, "It's too late. You shouldn't have been smoking all those years." And so they'd taken out everything in his throat, and they put this little tube in, and if he held his finger on it, you've seen it. Some of our families have had to use these. Put his finger over it, and he could make some noises, but mostly his dad wrote. And so the church leader had gone to his dad's hospital room to see his dad after he'd gone in there, and In every window in the hospital room, there were flowers. By the bed, there was a stack of cards, he said, 20 inches high. Even that thing they swing over the bed to put your food on, that thing was covered with flowers, and there were cards sprinkled through all the flowers. And so this church leader said that he started looking through the cards and started looking through the flowers, and he said every one of them was from either groups or individuals, persons in that church. His father couldn't speak, and so he got a Kleenex box, and he wrote on the side of it, and he wrote on the side of the Kleenex box, he wrote a quote from Hamlet. So if you're familiar with Hamlet, he wrote these words, "In this harsh world, draw your breath in pain to tell my story." And the son said, "I will, but what is it? What is your story? What do you want me to tell?" The next line the father wrote was, "I was wrong." He was wrong. And so this church leader got up to leave this lady's house. He'd been there, and he said, "You're wrong. In my work," he said, "I get to travel around all over the country, and I never go to a town that, I don't care how big or small the town is, that wherever you find that there's need, wherever there's a house in distress or pain or bereavement, you look and you'll see a set of Christians' footprints who have come with something, a word, a pie, a meal, a gift, something, a few words, a prayer." And he said, "People everywhere care." This woman said, "Really?" He said, "Yes." And she said, "Name some. Name some." She wants names. Who cares? Can I give her your name? Can I give her your name? Would you pray with me?